All right, so the next person we're going to have reading is Richard Thomas, and we have a bit of a history with Richard Thomas. The first time he fell on my radar was, believe it or not, like 4 maybe years ago. Olivia sent me a message. He said, yeah, there's this local guy who's doing like a class on some sort of like writing or something like that, and I'm going to take it. And I was like, all right, yeah, cool, sounds good. 3 years, 4 years later, we're like hanging out with Richard all the time, going to readings, and publishing him in our book, the book anthology. So we've had a long time where we've spent hung out with Richard, published him, had him on our podcast and everything, and that's why we give him the amount of crap that we give him. But really, he's an excellent guy, one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet, and if you are a writer, one of the biggest advocate for independent writers you'll ever find. So yeah, we got a little bio for him.
All right, Richard Thomas is sitting right there. He's the author of 6 books. One of them that's not out yet. I'm not getting tricked twice on this. Disintegration, The Breaker, Transubstantiate, Herniated Roots, Staring into the Abyss, and The Soul Standard. His over 100 stories in print include Cemetery Dance, Pank, Gargoyle, Weird Fiction Review, and Midwestern Gothic. He is also the editor of 3 anthologies out in 2014, The New Black, which is available here today for you to purchase. The Lineup, 25 provocative women, writers, and Bird Tongues, which is not the same thing. Bird Tongues is a totally separate book, which he co-edited with Chuck Palahniuk. Without further ado, Richard Thomas.
Thank you guys, I appreciate that. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I also appreciate that. I should say that Jack is actually in that anthology, The Lineup. She has a story in there. And Brandon is in Burt Tongues. So, Ben, I'm sorry I didn't get you into something, but maybe next time around.
I'm feeling very left out.
If you want, we could just start one tonight. We probably got enough writers in the room. We could just put one together right now. So tonight I'm going to read 2 short stories because they're both relatively short. The first one's almost, the second one's almost flash fiction, so it won't be too long. I promised people that I would read one story that is unpublished, and then I wanted to read another one, Asking for Forgiveness, which was published recently at Menacing Hedge, but it's something I really like. It's kind of a dense little dark story, so I'll read that one in a second. But I will start off with an original story called Little Red Wagon, which is not published yet, and you're hearing for the first time here, and I hope you enjoy it. Rebecca hated her father for what he'd done, refusing to help him dig the grave, arms crossed, tears running down her face, the body under the tarp, no longer Grandpa. No more secret conversations when they were alone, just the 2 of them now. Her father the killer, her father and his constant worries, her father convinced that the old man had finally fallen sick. They'd been alone for a long time now, the 3 of them living off the land, the radio antenna built up tall in the backyard, stretching up into the sky. Nobody ever answered, but she sat in the kitchen turning the knobs, trying to find a sign of life anyway. The black box sat on the table, static and interference crackling from the device, a puddle of blood on the floor where her grandfather had fallen, the hammer that killed him still lying there like a sleeping snake. Sitting next to her, the thick black lab nuzzled her hand, whimpering. Sadie was upset. She didn't know what to do, and neither did Rebecca. She was a teenager now, but inside she was still a child, a baby, and she felt helpless. 1%, that's what Grandpa had said. Only 1% had survived. This had been several years ago when 1% meant something. He'd tug on his long gray beard and stare at the television set as the man on the news rattled on, updates so infrequent, most of the population dead and gone now. Around them the world had simply gone silent, no cars driving by, no planes overhead, with the farm still functioning, but just barely. Their pantry was filled with canned goods. It had been easy to drive around their small town and fill up the bed of their pickup truck with more. In the beginning, the stench had been unbearable, meat going bad, bodies lying everywhere, but over time, the animals and elements picked at the bones, leaving little behind but broken white skeletons. 1% had turned into another 1%, and that's when it all went quiet, went dark. The second wave erupted, the mutation, airborne or dormant, nobody knew, and then no more frantic man on the television set, hair sticking out in all directions, shouting at the camera. No, there was nothing more after that. Grandfather talked about keeping the race alive, that they had to find a female, a woman. That was why he had the radio going, why he built the tower, why they constantly scrolled up and down the dial looking for any survivors. He was a handyman, Grandpa, able to build most anything out in the barn with his tools, his charts. His years of engineering so helpful now that the world had moved on. A stack of books sat by his leather recliner: biomechanics, computer programming, artificial intelligence, bionics. What's your earliest memory, Grandpa asked her. What do you mean? Think back, he said, easing into the recliner. What do you remember? The very first thing you can think of. Rebecca sat on the couch and pulled her long brown hair behind her head and into a ponytail, and something she did when she was concentrating. Anything? He nudged, his hands together in a steeple pressed to his lips. I remember a little red wagon, Rebecca said, and he nodded, and inside it are a bunch of puppies. Little black bundles of fur. Was that here on the farm? She asked. Grandpa didn't answer, merely raised his eyebrows and pursed his lips. They'd been born on the farm, and I was taking them down to the end of the driveway. There were 6 of them. We were going to give them away. He told me I could keep the last one, but only the last one. That must have been Sadie. What's 2 times 4, Rebecca? 4, silly. What's 4 times 4? 16. 12 times 12? 144. Grandpa paused, looking at her as Rebecca focused in on him, her eyes shifting. The pupils getting smaller, then larger, then smaller again. 144 times 144. 20,736. Good girl, he said. Rebecca stood in the kitchen watching her father dig the grave out beyond the apple trees, the shovel piercing the dirt over and over again. She loved her grandfather, even when he wanted to examine her. He said it was important, their little secret. And this is what her father had yelled at her about as he stood over her grandfather's body. But he was wrong, so very wrong. After the world went silent, after they'd filled the pantry with canned goods and planted a new harvest, made sure the pigs still had their slop, their chickens clucking at their feet, all they had was each other. The well wouldn't run dry, Grandpa assured them. They had water and food and solar panels lining the roof as well as the barn, the windmills spinning and always spinning at the back of their 20 acres down by the creek. Grandpa said he saw it coming. It was only a matter of time. He said a lot of things when she was lying on the cold metal table out in the faded red barn. In the beginning, she thought it was just part of her education. No school anymore, so Grandpa would toss out math questions, give her writing assignments, talk to her about history and even human anatomy. It used to be exams at the kitchen table, stethoscope on her bony chest where breasts refused to grow. Seemed she'd always been 12 years old. He'd look in her eyes and make noises, humming to himself, muttering okay, and yes, and just fine. As he looked in her nose, checked out her sinuses, made her stick her tongue out. He didn't start taking her out to the barn until her incident with the fingers. She came to him as he sat in the recliner, a book in his lap. Father was nowhere to be found. And if Rebecca had probed her memories, she'd find that to be very accurate at first. She was pale as a sheet, sweat running down her face, the fingers on her right hand bent backward and sideways at a strange angle. No blood, merely broken fingers, bent fingers. Grandpa, she said, Grandpa, help me. Help me, something's wrong. He leaped up out of his seat, the book falling to the floor. Sadie standing up, always the same weight, always black, her muzzle never getting gray, barking at the sudden movement in Rebecca's panicked voice. It's okay, sweetie, he said, rushing to her as she stared down at her mangled hand, holding it gingerly but feeling no pain. Sick to her stomach and yet no blood gushed forth. He put his hands on her shoulders. It's okay, I can fix it, I can splint it, he said. She felt his hands on her neck, her shoulders pressing down as if searching for something, and then she fainted. When she woke up, her right hand was in a cast. It's okay, honey, her grandfather said. It wasn't nearly as bad as she thought. A few fingers were merely jammed, 2 broken, but I set them right. You should be okay. Any pain, he asked. Rebecca shook her head. There was no pain, none at all. She sat up on the cold metal table and looked around the barn. Sadie jumped up and placed her front paws on the metal table, licking Rebecca's bare leg. And then her father was around more. Suddenly he was a dominant presence on the farm, always keeping an eye on her, chopping wood, feeding the chickens, no longer the ghost of rumor that he used to be. Used to be, she'd think. She searched her memory for her father and saw him driving away in a beige sedan. A salesman, she thought, the letters popping up in her head like a neon sign. Then she saw him with a briefcase walking in the front door. She saw him place airline tickets on the kitchen table and pour himself a cup of coffee. Yes, she saw her father well. After the accident, she would meet Grandpa in the barn on a monthly basis, but only when her father was out cutting the grass or running the thresher. Her grandfather said it was because he had to examine her, make sure everything was working right, and that it was okay for a doctor, for him now, but not in front of her father. He wouldn't understand. It always made her sleepy lying on the table. He poked and prodded, mostly by her head, always studying her eyes, what he called optics. When he muttered to himself, he was gentle, always gentle, and by the time his hands were on her shoulders, her head, she'd fallen asleep. The question certainly didn't make Rebecca's father feel included, the way she and Grandpa would talk in the living room, math and science, complex equations and theorems, always going quiet when her father came into the room. They would laugh and say that he had plenty of education already. Go milk the cows, they'd chuckle. Go toss some hay around. And they'd both make muscles, flex them, and her father would scowl and leave the room. He never had a good sense of humor. Her father was a quiet man, a big guy, strong and silent, a bit of a worker bee, she used to think to herself. Grandpa would say that he was so grateful her father was around more, now that he was getting old, and she could see it in his eyes. His hair and beard sprouting more white every day, the way his skin wrinkled and the spots by his wrists. She worried about him. But it gave Rebecca comfort to see her father outside in the yard, splitting timber, lugging buckets of water or slop, bales of hay tossed around as if they were nothing, a downed tree cut and split, only the trunk left, a chain attached, a tractor pulling it, and then his massive arms wrapping around the roots, pulling it out and lifting it up as if it were made of paper. All it took was one time, one instance of her walking out of the barn, buttoning up her blouse, and her father's scowl turned into rage. She heard them yelling, Grandpa assuring him it was science. There were no doctors down. He was the only mind they had, that he was just making sure Rebecca was healthy. Her father wasn't very trusting, almost simple at times. She'd seen him cry over a dead rabbit that had been gutted by a fox, holding the creature in his lap, rocking back and forth, so distraught. It had upset Rebecca. Not the dead rabbit, it was just nature after all, but him. He had upset her, his reaction. No emotion, never laughing, never joking, never singing or dancing when Grandpa put on some music, but this, crying over the rabbit. It made no sense to her. So she stood in the kitchen and watched her father bury the old man, Sadie licking her hand. She was suddenly tired, her batteries run down, and so she went to her bedroom and lay down on the floral sheet, staring out the window at the setting sun, orange turning to red, so tired, so sad. Maybe Grandpa had been sick after all. 1% of 1% of 1%. She closed her eyes and replayed the scene at the kitchen table, her grandpa holding her hand, trying to explain something to her, what was out in the barn, frozen and kept for a reason. He spoke about her as if she were two entirely separate people, and he spoke of her father the same way. He talked about her mother, and when he said the word mother, a jolt went through Rebecca, a wave of confusion crashing in her head, and where there should have been memories, nothing. He said he'd fix everything in time, but he was getting old. He needed help. The work he'd done wouldn't last forever. The radio signal must be stronger. He spoke of amplifiers and how they might have to travel, all the while holding her hand, and yet all she could do was stare at him. Mother. It didn't add up. Didn't compute. Why had she never asked about her mother? And why was there nothing to cling to, no memory? Her father had walked in and stood by the door, his face an eternal frown. The day after her grandfather had talked to her in earnest, trying to explain that they were running out of time, she lay in bed not wanting to get up, a candle burning on her desk, vanilla and sandalwood drifting to the ceiling. Images of her mother came rushing back to her, hanging laundry on a line outside, her auburn tresses flowing in the wind, her mother with an apron full of eggs coming from the chicken coop, her mother singing a lullaby as she poured water over Rebecca's head in the bath, smiling as she did it. In time, her grandfather had said, standing in the doorway, give me time. I'll make it all whole again, I promise. But now he was gone. Rebecca felt weak, unable to rise. On the floor by her bed, Sadie slept, hardly moving at all. Rebecca could feel the great shadow of her father in the doorway, standing there, silent. Dad, Rebecca asked, tears in her eyes. Dad, come here. The big man lumbered over, Sadie not even raising her head. Tell me about my mother. I can hardly picture her. What happened? Where did she go? He sighed and placed his hand over hers. I don't know, honey. What do you mean, she said. I don't remember. Rebecca stared at him as she felt the energy draining out of her body. What do you remember, she asked. Her father sat there, arms heavy, his head hanging, a slow whirring sound filling the air, his frame suddenly growing weak, the room dark and quiet. What's the first thing you remember? Go back as far as you can. What's your first memory, Rebecca asked. Her father stared at the floor, the gears turning, trying to think back, to remember, something from his childhood. He held her hand, no longer warm, cool to the touch. I remember a little red wagon, he said, and she nodded. And inside it are a bunch of puppies, little black bundles of fur. Rebecca closed her eyes, 2 tears slipping out, as her chest moved up and down slowly, and then, not at all. They'd been born on the farm when I was taking them down to the end of the driveway. There were 6 of them, and we were going to give them away. Somebody told me I could keep the last one, but only the last one. Who was that? He asked the room. But there was no response. He remained silent. He held his daughter's hand, now cold, the black lab at his feet not stirring. The house around him closing in, the silence deafening. What have I done? He asked. Sorry, it always gets to me a little bit. I have a boy and a girl, so sometimes, makes me a little sad, my own writing. Anyway, here's the second one. This is asking for forgiveness. It's a little shorter. Thank you for your patience. We stand at the edge of the ancient forest, yellow, blurry eyes weeping with sickness, as a cool breeze pushes through the leaves, the light flickering in the cabin as the day starts to slip away. We are more than we were last month, double what was birthed last year, and none of us remember being upright. We stand on all four now as if this was how we were made. We watch the boy fill his bucket with sand and then empty it and then fill it again, sitting there with his short blonde hair and overalls, smacking his lips as we smack our warped mouths open and shut, not a care in the world. The lad, acres of dead land stretching out in every direction, her eyes on him from the kitchen, our eyes on him from the drifting shade. Lips cracking as our fetid grins widen, the teeth come out, sour saliva spilling onto the dirt path, our gangly limbs shaking, sores mottled with flies and squirming maggots, waiting for the right time to claim him as our own. The sun is descending, the moon slow to rise, and the boy still plays in the box, no sign of the change yet. A cough from him, and he stands up slowly, thumb in his mouth, rubbing at his eyes with tiny fists, falling back down and then gradually tipping over. The screen door creaks open as she wipes her long, slender fingers on the stained, faded apron, a stray strand of yellow hair tucked back as she steps outside, slow to approach him, humming something under her breath, hoping the boy is tired, not shifting, hoping that the movement she sees in the encroaching woods is nothing more than the fluttering wind, her sigh in unison, the boy merely asleep. We murmur mother, but her gaze only touches the edge of the yard before darting away. We must bide our time now. We were too early, it seems. So we retreat to the cave where one by one she brought us, hand in hand, down a long, winding path, thorny branches reaching out, nipping at our bare, mottled flesh. For each of us it was a secret, something she whispered to us in the middle of the night, her vanilla lavender lips on our foreheads, her promises and apologies falling on deaf, damaged ears. She was our mother, and we were her children. We trusted her when we were submerged in the bath, soap bubbles and laughter, pushing our heads under, but then lifting us back up. Her tears were tears of joy, we thought. She always brought us back up into the light, up out of the water. She never kept us under. Perhaps those hesitations, those extra seconds, went unnoticed. On the nights when the moon filled the sky and the windows leaked light, she would open the creaking door and slip away for hours on end. But what were we to think? She always had something to do. Water from the well, fruit from the bent apple tree, down on her knees in the garden, pulling and grunting, basket over one arm, basket over the other, knife in the kitchen slicing, boiling water, oil heating, a slip here and there, a gasp and a red trickle, but these are the ways of the land. Nothing here was foreign. The berries on the other side of the hill, sometimes strawberries, sometimes blue. Her hair filled with twigs, the scratches up and down her arms most definitely from thorns, not him. The clothes drying on the line, her delicates, never dotted with blood. It must be the berries, we told ourselves. What did we know? We were babies then, still babies now. In the cave, we snap at each other and then huddle in the middle, pressed up against each other for warmth, for companionship out of habit and memory, and we hope for something more. Perhaps tomorrow we will stop the cycle, or perhaps she will bring him here, the coward that she is. Our father was a rumor, an echo, something only to be seen out of the corner of your eye. Our father was a woodsman, arms like tree limbs, beard as if born from bear, disappearing for days, for weeks, returning with so many things. Tiny bird skulls, beads on a string, flowers from mother with purple blossoms and veiny leaves. The wood was stacked along one side of the cabin as high as it could go. The steady chop, the split of the timber, just part of the day, or so we were told. Our father was the cold creek that ran south of our home, filled with silverbacked fish, with blood orange meat, whispering every time we neared it, quenching our thirst, promises of sleepy peace if only we'd step a bit closer. Our father was the frosty moon that pasted the land with silence as our breath formed clouds of pain, feet bruised and bleeding, his laughter running over the mountain, guiding us down one ravine and up the other, wandering from hill to valley and back, some elusive destination always out of reach. Our Father was time, stretched in every direction, elastic as a rubber band, as slow and anchored as a wall of granite, our eyes closing, waking up sore, gray where black had been. All lies. Everything she had ever told us was a lie. She never loved us, or it wouldn't be like this. In the night there was a flash of silver. Our Father returned, and in the morning I stand alone at the edge of the woods. I heard them crying. I saw him approach, his hand on each one of us, muttering kind words, his voice nearly forgotten, his muscled grip soothing, then choking, then ripping, the piercing of flesh, and my kin was held down, one by one, eyes wide open and yet disbelieving. I too did not move, did not understand. Perhaps she had seen us, feared us, known what we planned to do, the bloodline destined to end by our teeth and claws and squinting eyes. Father would not allow it. He had returned with thunder and lightning and vengeance, a great rain pouring down outside, washing away our sins. I alone was spared, the eldest. Alone now I have lost my way, finding it hard to leave the cave, until the stench grows so foul that I force myself to grab them, one by one, and drag their filthy bodies down the rocky path that spilled to the east, casting them over the edge of the mossy cliff, one by one, not looking down, not taking note, merely laboring on because questions still remained. Why me? Why any? With nothing left to do but watch and wait, I would wake when the sun pushed into the cave and stumble down to the edge of the forest, smoke rising out of the stack, the woodpile never shrinking, something he could do right. And I would stare at her as she opened the creaking door, a bucket of water tossed outside, a sigh, and her hands upon her back, bending backwards and moaning, taking a deep breath, swelling up again, the moon reaping its harvest. I wanted to hate her as much as I wanted her praise. Anything, any gesture at all, so hungry I was for even a scrap. Back inside and then out with a basket, laundry on the line, the boy stepping gingerly behind her, walking now, his head on a swivel this way and that, sniffing the air, his hand reaching out for her hem, taller now, a twitch in his shoulders, scanning the land for what, I do not know. When she finally brings me the boy, I can see he is not well. This experiment she keeps trying, once again a disaster. He is naked, standing, but beginning to hunch over, his eyes a cream like spoiled milk, his lips distended, teeth pushing around his mouth in crooked horror, his hand in hers as she stands there swelling, tears in her eyes, rubbing her mouth with the back of her hand, speaking my name. I had forgotten my name. Her hand is on my neck, rubbing, patting, petting, as she pleads with me to take care of him, to not grow bitter, to find it in my heart to welcome my brother into the woods, while she tries once again to find a cure. I do not hate her any longer, my mother, my beacon, for the land is empty. My father continues his long walks in every direction, north into the cold, the winter and frost, fingers ruddy and numb, south into the dry heat, vultures, tumbleweeds, and one false oasis after another. She will continue to try in this barren wasteland to be the mother that no one else can be. She will not let us expire this last great race. She will not let it all end with a whimper and a cough, a last gasp and shuddering sickness. She will swim in the water. She will kneel in the moonlight. She will pray to the lost gods and bleed into her solitude. My father standing with his shadow cast out, darkness ever creeping, asking for forgiveness.
Richard Thomas, everybody. Another uplifting story to continue the reading.